what I think people were shocked by was, first of all, the weakness of our institutions, which just capitulated all over. I think that was very much the case, that people, I have never known them to seem so bewildered and so upset, because they took it as a personal attack. And I would say that it's meant as a personal attack. It's an attack, if you like, on your context. It's an attack on the kind of context in which you've lived. And I think that the way that you give the people a voice is you have to ultimately give people something to vote for.
Hello and welcome to Reasoned with me, Darren Grimes. Please do consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell if you enjoy today's show. We're also now over halfway to our fundraising target. The link's in the description. Any help you can give there really does go a long way in ensuring we can produce our content. So thank you very much. Now, on to actually what you're here for. Cultural conservatives have long, most of my life I would argue, probably even longer, that the decline in teaching of history would lead to mass ignorance. But could anyone have foreseen or predicted that it would lead to a rise in cultural revolutionaries? It seems like each week now there's a new assault on British history, our statues, our culture, the BBC Proms, you name it, they want it gone. Why is this happening and what can we do about it? Well, joining me to discuss is Peter Whittle. Peter is a member of the London Assembly and the founder and director of the New Culture Forum. And Emma Webb is the director of the Forum, let's see if I get this right, Emma, the Forum on Integration, Democracy and Extremism, which is part of the Civitas think tank. Hello to both of you.
Hello, Darren.
Now, Peter, before we get on to statues, I want to ask you about the BBC Proms U-turn. Now, after massive public backlash, Land of Hope and Glory and Rule Britannia will now be sung in the Royal Albert Hall. Do you think this is a sign of the tide turning against the wokerati?
Short answer to that, Darren, is no. I'm afraid. This is obviously encouraging to us, simply because it shows actually that what public pressure can do, is remarkable. And in fact, there was one national newspaper had a poll, a petition that they were putting forward. We put the pressure on as well, and of course, Lawrence Fox. It was great when he actually went ahead and managed to, get people to put Land of Hope and Glory at the top of the charts, iTunes charts. But we shouldn't really see this anything other than a false dawn. All we've had with the last night, and I'm very pleased about, don't get me wrong, is that basically something which I think is emblematic. This was emblematic. And I think wise the council prevailed, and possibly a bit of panic too. And they sort of thought, wait a minute, the tide, if you like, the tide is turning, not to contradict what I just said, but perhaps with the BBC, I think we are actually seeing something change quite fundamentally there. Because I think that I can remember before both of you were born, in the 1980s, BBC bias was all about Tory politicians, getting on the Today programme and saying, why do you not interview us as much as you interview Labour people? I think the difference now is that the majority of people realise that it's not just about news and interviews, that the kind of ideology of the BBC pervades everything. It pervades all its output. That, I think, people are far more aware of, which is good.
Yeah. Now, Emma, as well, the BBC's reporting, of course, of the toppling of Edward Colston, the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol, that was something that really got your back up, and it's something that I think binds the two of you. You're both intensely passionate about the Save Our Statues campaign. What do you think it was, Emma, that made you realise you had to do something once Edward Colston's statue fell? And what do you think it says about the BBC around the reporting of that statue falling?
Yeah, so I think that, both Peter and I, we saw, what had happened with Colston, and this is something that just looked, typical of cultural revolutionary activity. And we knew that this was something that was going to snowball, because the groundwork had already been laid so deeply within all of our institutions. And the issue there, of course, is that when you have, elected politicians, parliamentarians, they are in some way at least still answerable to the people, whereas the people within the institutions, and even to some degree within the local authorities, the people making the decisions around this, were at first being pressured by the mob, and then because of people like Sadiq Khan legitimizing what the mob was doing, this then started to become an institutional problem. And I think that was what we were really worried about, was that the people that are the caretakers of our and custodians of our heritage, and this was obvious that from the ideology behind it, that it was never going to be just about statues. It was always going to be about songs, about every aspect of our cultural inheritance. It was always going to end up being about books, as we've now seen in the British Library. And as you pointed out, this is based on ignorance. In one sense, they're trying to scrub clean the public sphere of anything historical, anything that they identify as being associated with whiteness or with British heritage, which they think is complicit in white supremacy. And now we're at the stage where places like the British Library, they're talking about removing the statues of people like Beethoven and Mendelssohn. So this is what has been described as repudiation inflation, where you start with people that are more directly associated perhaps with slavery, and then you end up with some of our greatest classical composers.
How similar is that to Mao's Cultural Revolution? Are there massive parallels between the two?
In a way, the parallels are almost amusing. So they wanted to remove anything from packaging that was from the pre-revolutionary era. So they wanted to remove things like golden pagodas and things that were associated. They also wanted to get rid of and did ban the traditional Chinese operas that were really popular in areas, more rural areas. So there are lots of similarities, the ways that it was the young people, the students going after their teachers, and pretty much the comparisons are amusing and endless. But at the same time, we have to remember that this is our own specific cultural moment that has its own dynamics that are particularly worrying, and the fact that they are really just going for anything that is regarded as British. So just going back to the example of the British Museum with Hans Sloane, and you mentioned the BBC's reporting on this. Well, if you look at the way that ITV have reported on the removal of Hans Sloane's statue from the British Museum, they refer to him as a slave trader. And he's been referred to variously as a slave trader or a beneficiary of slavery. But this is ignorance, because he wasn't a slave trader. His wife's ex-husband had a plantation in Jamaica, and he received some income from that, but was far more than that. And it's the same with people like the figure of Picton, who was a hero at the Battle of Waterloo. And many of these historical figures, Robert Peel is a perfect example of their ignorance, because even when they realised they were asking for the wrong Robert Peel to be removed, they still wanted the statues to be removed anyway. So the ignorance is endless, and it's an attack on anything viewed as associated with whiteness, which is the sort of ideology behind this. Which means that in Ontario, we've even seen recently attacks on statues of the Virgin Mary being decapitated, religious Christian iconography, which is, classic cultural revolutionary stuff. It could be taken from not just Mao's revolution, but from revolutionary France, from the Reformation, from, take your pick.
Repudiation inflation, where things just simply go outwards and outwards, ripple outwards. A very good example, you were talking about slavery there, Emma, and you can I think it is not too implausible to suggest that, say, the BBC, for example, does these great adaptations of our classics on Sunday nights, and everyone loves them, and always did love them, and so they do Jane Austen and what have you. And I can see a time where basically people are saying, well, wait a minute, take Pride and Prejudice, take these books, all the characters that we love, Mr. Darcy and all these people, well, they essentially, all of their life, all of this lifestyle in these houses, it was all basically based, wasn't it, on slavery? I mean, and should we even really be celebrating, or should we be saying, should we be adapting these books? You can see how that would cross their mind. So before you know it, you stop having classic books being done. You start to have them with contextualizing forwards in them. And I mean, that is actually, I would say, also would have to be entirely resisted, because like the contextualizing plaques that we're seeing on statues, because it's like half the way there for them. I mean, it's like the door is ajar then. And I think you've absolutely got to be blanket, say no, like President Macron said about statues, for better or worse, these are the deeds of French history, and that is it. We still haven't really had that from our government.
Emma, do you agree with that? Do you think it's ever right to topple a statue?
No, never. I think that what Peter is describing there as well is, you mentioned Mao earlier, and this is it's an all-encompassing ideology. It's a kind of almost like religious self-mortification that we're seeing going on in all of these institutions. I think it was Brendan O'Neill described this as an orgy of self-loathing, and that's exactly what it is. And as with all cultural revolutions, it is all-encompassing in the sense that there is nothing that it's not going to go for. People have written, that in Mao's China, that everything down to sewing manuals had to have a little forward in relating to Maoist doctrine. And I think that is something that I think even if it's not articulated, people are worried about that, because they know that there's nothing that this isn't going to go for. It's only going to get more and more absurd. There is no limit to where this can go. And so I think what we've seen with the BBC doing this U-turn, it goes to show that for a long time, one of the reasons why these groups have and this ideology has been so successful within our institutions is because there has been no cost to them running with this, because people haven't stood up and said, no, we don't agree with this. We're not going to go ahead with this. But because they're finally starting to go for things that really touch a nerve, and I would say they're almost going for the things that touch a nerve intentionally to try and provoke a reaction, as the very graphic images of in Canada, for example, toppling their first prime minister in a very dramatic scene of this huge beautiful statue falling to the ground, and going for people like Churchill and for symbolic things. That's touched a nerve. And yes, I agree with Peter. I think it's only a very, very small victory, not really even a victory, because they barely even admitted that they responded almost like children.
So you think that's them seeing how far they can push it, basically, by going for the likes of Churchill?
Yeah, I think that there is a small victory in people speaking up and saying, no, we won't go along with this, and putting up some resistance, so that institutions, and particularly our primary cultural institutions, realise that there is a cost to what they're doing on that front. And so, like with every revolution, they always end up going after the books or the antiques and all of these things that British people, normal British people, not the snobby elite that are mostly behind this, that I think that those are things that normal people really care about.
Yeah.
And so there is an opportunity, at least here, for people to be able to say, no, we're not going to have this. Enough is enough.
You've been speaking to Douglas Murray recently, and I was struck by something that he said, in which he says that, if you're given some advice by a friend who says, I care about you, I'm giving you some friendly advice because I want you to do well in life. He says that should apply to a nation as well, right? In that if someone genuinely wants the nation to do well, we should listen to them. But why do you think, Peter, that they're in the media, even I'd argue politicians, and where is the Conservative Party in all of this? But there is this reluctance to listen to anyone that actually wants this nation to do well, and far too often do we hear the voices of those who actually think this nation is a racist backwater and we might as well just give up and go somewhere else. That United Kingdom means absolutely nothing as far as its history and what it stands for is concerned. How do you think actually we can change that as far as that infiltrating our culture is concerned?
I think obviously Douglas was entirely right. it's obvious that basically the people we're talking about, they don't wish the country well at all. They don't wish British history well. They don't wish Western civilization well. And essentially, it's a mixture, I think, of a sort of strange, it's self-loathing mixed with nihilism, because quite often these people don't actually believe in, anything else. They're not putting forward anything. We even seen that, with many of the demonstrations. You ask actually, well, what do you want? Okay, with Black Lives Matter, it was a kind of rather crude form of Marxism that they were talking about, abolish the family, abolish the capitalist system. But I think that generally in our culture, I think the problem is this, Darren, really, is that for a long time, and I know this from my own conversations, the Tory party thought that they mistook this kind of self-loathing for good old-fashioned British reticence, and sort of like almost a romantic type of idea. Oh, well, we don't do. I remember David Cameron saying back when he was Prime Minister, David Cameron, the original footnote in history, he said something like, we don't do flags, right? And I remember at the time thinking, well, actually, I think things have changed. We've got to do flags, right? But it was very much part of that sort of old-fashioned patrician Tory idea that there was something a bit below the salt about being very obviously patriotic. There was something rather distasteful about it. We didn't need to. And it was, I suppose, fair enough. It was based on a kind of sense of innate superiority, you might say. It was sort of based on a kind of imperial superiority. But anyway, that sort of attitude amongst many Tories has stuck. So, when you say to them and you explain, no, we're talking about people, whether it's in the teaching unit or people who run the British Library or people at the BBC or in all of our broadcast media, they are never going to celebrate Britain because they don't like it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They don't like it. And they almost sort of like take a comfort, if you like. It seemed odd, but they take a comfort in being opposed to it, and because it makes them feel superior as well. Yeah. And don't ever underestimate that. I think that when it comes to what we do, I would say that there is one way in which you could look at the situation at the moment, and if you're trying to be optimistic about it, this is one way. You could say that what we have been droning on about for years, all of us, and that is, the long march through the institutions, the takeover of the culture by people who hate it. Their hand is open now. We're seeing it all. It's no longer something we talk about that people say, no, what are you talking about? You're just paranoid. It's right there. They've made it quite clear. We know now who we're dealing with. There is something in that. That is useful. Even if it means that it's nasty for us and it's a battle for us, at least they're out in full view in many ways, mm-hmm. Right?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a really good point. Emma, I wonder is there a real problem with arguing, those on our side of the argument, being able to articulate how we should actually relate to, or indeed give the facts of, historically, at least in our schools and other institutions like the museums, for example, how do we avoid applying the impossible, which I think is what's responsible for what's happening at the minute, but it obviously has ulterior motives, but applying the impossible standards of 2020, and I mean moral standards, to the figures of our past who can never ever hope to ever keep up with the standards of today, which, by the way, I think most of us can't keep up with, hence why we are at risk of being cancelled every 2 minutes. But, how do we actually put across to our kids, etc., the figures of our past and the nuances around them?
Yeah, I think all revolutionary ideas are like a treadmill that just gets faster and faster and faster, and everybody eventually ends up falling smack onto their faces. But it's something that, I mean, Darren, you've mentioned this before as well, that it's that we seem to have lost within our culture generally, and perhaps this is to do with the decline of Christianity in the West, any understanding of forgiveness or intellectual humility or even moral humility, that, you know, we may judge historical figures, our generations that come after us will judge us. There are going to, or for certain, be many things that future generations are going to say, what morally were they thinking? And so I think what we really need is to bring back that old-fashioned Christian understanding of forgiveness within the public sphere as well, so that we can look at historical figures and not see everything in this black and white terms. And I think that actually, if you look at it, this is not just about BLM. I think that this is a broader cultural issue. And if you compare, for example, to Extinction Rebellion, before Black Lives Matter even came to the fore, I had been saying that I was concerned that Extinction Rebellion were committing acts of, damaging property and starting to go down a lawless path. And the police were responding in a completely limp and pathetic, hamstrung way. And then exactly the same thing happened with BLM. And I think and this is not just, obviously, I think we need to take some kind of, we need to take something from the fact this is not just happening in the UK. This is happening, it seems to be an Anglosphere issue, but this is also happening across the rest of Europe and North America as well. And I think we need to ask, you know, what is going on in terms of this? It's a new morality. It's a new ideology that is completely lacking in any forgiveness or subtlety. It's very Manichaean, black and white. And there's no room for judging anyone today or historical figures in any kind of nuanced way. And it means that, as I said before, you know, people can go after everything because every day something new is problematic. If you listen to some of these woke ideologues talking about things that are wrong or whatever, you know, there's a brilliant comedy sketch about this. You know, how do you tell a woke joke? It's not possible because everything eats itself. And I think that the only way that we can, as a culture, pull back from this is by doing something positive, not by just being reactive to all of the, you know, the awful cannibalistic self-loathing that's going on, but to try to put forward something new. Something based on forgiveness, based on nuance, and based on actual historical understanding. Because I actually agree with Black Lives Matter in a sense. I do think we should be teaching more history. I just don't think we should be teaching their fake narrative of our history.
Exactly. Peter, speaking of rewriting history, can I just ask you about the British Library and the British Museum? Because as we touched on, the British Museum has made statements about rewriting history, and the British Library's chief librarian has claimed that racism is a creation of white people and then backed calls for major cultural change at the institution. That was according to The Telegraph. What do you think the thinking is behind this, and how can we challenge it? Is it just a case of we have to fight this with our wallets and just not go to these institutions? What can we do?
Absolutely, Darren. First of all, with those two institutions, and also I would say probably the British Library has the edge there, because to me, the British Library is sort of like the very spine, if you like, of our culture, and indeed not just British culture. It's not just the repository of all our cultural memories. It's also one of the bedrocks of Western civilization. The point is that these institutions, British Library, British Museum, most public institutions actually in Britain now, they now define themselves in terms of political objectives. So, for example, diversity and inclusion. These are the two, diversity and inclusion. Everything, if you ask what most public institutions are about now, or even for that matter, some private companies, they will sort of say, oh, it's diversity and inclusion. So in fact, the actual function, what they're actually meant to be doing, suffers. Quite often, they're quite incompetent, they're very badly run. People don't understand what they're actually meant to be doing, because it's all about singing from the same ideological song sheet. I think that in terms of the British Library, they actually broke some of the rules of what they're actually meant to be doing in terms of suggesting that people support a political organisation, in this case Black Lives Matter. And indeed, I think there were also calls whether or not to support people like Diane Abbott's campaign about COVID and racism. And this is sort of not what they're meant to be doing at all. In answer to your question, it's not really down to us and our, if you like, our wallets in these cases. I'm afraid it's down to public money. And it comes actually to the point where, what do you do? You ask me, what do you do about this? Right. Well, you can try and win hearts and minds and you can wait for generations, or you can actually say, we've got to take away, the 90 million that the British Library gets if they continue to do this. Now, of course, that leaves people like us in a bit of a bind because we think the British Library is a magnificent institution. We think, so that the museum is too. We don't want to, make these things impoverished in any way. But it might come to the point where the only way you can actually force change, and that same goes for the BBC, because when we talk about the license fee, we're talking about the same thing, is actually say you're not getting this money anymore. Yeah, you've got to do what you're meant to do. Otherwise, you don't get it.
Emma, I've got two questions from what Peter's just said. I think they're really important points. First of all, where do you think this Conservative government with an 80-seat majority is actually at on this? I'm not asking you to get your crystal ball out and read Boris Johnson's mind. I mean, why are they not actually doing what Peter has just so eloquently suggested? And secondly, your thoughts on the British Museum and actually the removal of the bust of the founding father from its pedestal and the labelling of him as a slave owner. You did touch on this earlier, and actually confronting those links to colonialism. How would you actually confront those links to colonialism?
Well, firstly, on the Conservative Party, I think they need to pull their finger out, and not just on this, but on lots of things that you would think the Conservative Party would pick up and run with. The illegal immigration coming across the channel, there's a definite sense that they're all talk. I mean, Boris Johnson has said some really good things about this, and so has the Culture Secretary as well, and apparently intervened also in the case of the Museum of the Home wanting the demands that were being made to get rid of the statues there. So, I think that we know where their heart is, but it's certainly not where their action is. I think they just need to pull their finger out and really put their foot down, send a message. And I actually think that we need some kind of legislation to protect our heritage more than just what we have at the moment, which is the listing of certain monuments. But we need, obviously there is this war memorials bill that's been proposed. We need more than that to protect, our actual institutions. As Peter said, these institutions, they are supposed to serve a specific purpose. That purpose should not be politicized. It's like art. You can't have good politicized art. Art is just by its nature it's supposed to explore something deep and profound, not just, following along these utopian new revolutionary religious ideas that are going around. And I think it's the same with these institutions. It's like you can't have left-wing or right-wing comedy. If it makes you laugh, it makes you laugh. These institutions have a purpose, and that is supposed to be to elevate and to take the great civilizational heritage of the past and to bring that forward, not to try to destroy it or edit it in any way. And so I think that the government actually needs to start looking, particularly DCMS needs to start looking at how we can have policies and legislation to protect the purposes of these institutions so that they can't be kidnapped for political means on either side of the political spectrum. And also relating to you mentioned Hans Sloane. Well, we've seen actually that, they did say they wanted to rewrite our shared history. They have actually started to do that. I think it was Captain Cook received a new plaque or a new description board within the British Museum that described the artifacts that he had collected in the context of what they called the permanent occupation of Australia. I think that we need to be very careful with the contextualization of these plaques, because the temptation, of course, for people like Peter and I, is if you don't want statues removed, the temptation is to compromise in some way and say, well, add a plaque to contextualize it. The problem is that the plaques are also that are being suggested are also misleading. They're also just pushing forward this narrative, and particularly a narrative that only looks at historical figures through their relationship with colonialism, imperialism, the slave trade, and so on, when there is far much more than that to any historical figure. And this goes back down to the kind of reductionism in the debate generally and in everyone's thinking, both morally and historically, that, fine, add more information, just make it historically accurate and politically neutral information.
Mm-hmm.
I would add to that, if I may, Darren.
Of course.
Add to that what Emma's just said there. When it comes to these contextualizing plaques, I feel that's gonna become a meme at some stage. But when it comes to this, they're not actually calling for example, a contextualizing plaque which explains on Gandhi's statue some of the things that he might have said about Africans, which he did. That's not being asked for. It's entirely, as Emma points out, about decolonization. It's entirely about, the evils of Britain. That is actually what they want by contextualizing. If I can just address one thing, that again Emma was saying about the Tory party. I think to pull their finger out, yes. I think I would say that you're being quite kind there, actually, Emma. I think that a lot of them don't understand it. There are some people who do understand it in the Tory party, yeah. But I found it very interesting last week when Boris Johnson finally condemned the BBC. He went on television and said that it was wet and it was wrong. But he sort of started his remarks by saying, they tried to restrain me from saying this.
Yes.
And you sort of thought,
very revealing.
Yes, who are they and why would they be restraining you? It wasn't as he was incredibly sort of, I thought, very, very, it was a very banal statement he made anyway. I mean, very late in the day. But I think that really when it comes to politics and political parties, the Tory party, perhaps we have to say that what we maybe need is a sort of a new party or a movement which in some ways does what happened with the referendum. Originally UKIP and then it was the Brexit party. They pushed the Tory party, willy-nilly into doing this, into giving a referendum because they were too frightened. They looked at the polls, So maybe we have to do something similar in the culture wars, actually. Maybe we have to actually have something coming up on their right-hand flank which basically pushes them and makes them realize, and frightens them, because the one time you get action, particularly from the Tory party, is if they're worried about being or not being re-elected.
Well, Peter, you've basically, I think, already answered my last question, but you might want to add some more to it. I was just about to say, to close, I wonder if you might both reflect on how you think that the silent majority out there, the same silent majority that, was voting for UKIP back in the day to push the Conservative Party to give them an actual say over our relationship with Brussels, that silent majority will be wondering what the hell is going on with our country. Not just in our country, but across the West, actually. How can they actually stand up against this madness and reject this slide? It seems like an almost inevitable slide at the moment into the clutches of destructive Marxist ideology that's doing real damage, or attempts to do real damage, to unity in this country by those who are seeking nothing other, as far as I can tell, than to denigrate and destroy British history and culture. Do you want to just elaborate, add a bit more, Peter, and then I'll go to Emma?
Yeah, just a little bit more there. You're absolutely right. I have to say that during this summer, when we had the protests and then we suddenly saw, the graffiti on Churchill statue, it was the speed with which these things happened. And what I think people were shocked by was, first of all, the weakness of our institutions, which just capitulated all over. I think that was very much the case, that people, I have never known them to seem so bewildered and so upset, because they took it as a personal attack. And I would say that it's meant as a personal attack. It's an attack, if you like, on your context. It's an attack on the kind of context in which you've lived. And I think that the way that you give the people a voice is you have to ultimately give people something to vote for. That we can do everything we can, but ultimately, when it came to the referendum, and indeed when it came to pushing Brexit through the last hurdle, it required people, a party of some sort or a movement, which meant that people actually could vote for something. They could go to a rally and then they could go and put their cross next to something. And this is terribly important. This is terribly important. So in answer to your question, Dan, I would say, that is the way you give people a voice.
Mm. Emma?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that Peter has said. I think that people are experiencing this as genuine anguish. As Peter said, it's being experienced as a personal attack, and it's being experienced in that way because that's precisely what it is. And I think to some extent, this has, like as happened with Brexit, this has natural groundswell. People have seen, following the Brexit vote actually specifically, people have seen the left repeatedly, and the far left especially, repeatedly trying to circumvent democracy. It has happened, the Lib Dems are wonderful at this. It seems to be the only thing that they're interested in doing is finding ways to repeal former votes and to set up things like citizens' assemblies, as Extinction Rebellion want to do, which a citizens' assembly they say is an upgrade of our democracy, but is actually just another attempt to get as far away from the democratic opinion as possible. I think people have seen this repeatedly. They've seen the derision of the political establishment and the media towards them as individuals, towards the working class, this, as Orwell put it, this sneering attitude that they've had, generation after generation towards normal working people. I think that this, combined with this sudden onslaught against all of the things that symbolize the values of normal people, and an attempt to break the links between the people who have come before us and the people who are coming after us. I think this is something that really it really goes to the heart and draws blood, I think, from normal people. And so I think Peter is right. We do need to have something to vote for, but it's also platforms like Reasoned and all of these other things that Peter has done with the New Culture Forum and all of these new platforms that are springing up to give a platform to these people, because it's a lightning rod issue. And what we have to do is provide the lightning rod so that these people are no longer being ignored and sneered at, and realise that there are people who, going back to what you mentioned, Douglas saying, that do have their best interests in mind, that do want good for this country and don't just want to tear everything down that has worked so well over so many generations. And simply to say to people, you know what, it's okay to be you. It's all right to be English, to be British. You don't have to feel ashamed or flagellate yourself in the street. You don't have to become a socialist or a Marxist or, go about the street tearing everything down. It's okay to love the things that you love, and that's perfectly normal and natural. And there's nothing to be afraid of.
Now, where can people find you both on Twitter if they want to go on that left-wing cesspit?
Yeah, they can. I think it's PR Whittle. I'm at PR Whittle, I think.
Mine's horrible to say out loud. It's at Emma_A_Webb, 2 B's.
I'm sure they'll find it. Just search Emma Webb. Right, thank you again to both of you. And now, if you enjoyed this, please do consider subscribing to the channel. And as I said at the start, we are halfway over achieving our target, which is amazing. So please do consider donating if you can. Cheers for joining. Bye.